I will go to the office tomorrow and then everybody can sign.
Well,
Yes.
Yeah.
Like in school.
Yes.
Let's maybe wait 1 or 2 minutes more until we can.
Yes, okay, we will.
Good afternoon, Mr. Buzek. Can you hear us?
Good afternoon. Yes, I hear you very well. Thank you.
We hear you perfectly too, so we are set, I think.
Perfect.
Julia, I think we can begin already, unless, yeah, okay. Honorable representative of freedom of the media, honorable members of parliament, dear experts, distinguished guests, I'm pleased to welcome you to our web dialogue on the safety of female journalists online, the role for parliamentary action, organized jointly by the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the representative of freedom of the media. My name is Ilias Trochidis, and I work as a junior program officer for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly International Secretariat in Vienna. And together with my colleague, Julia Haas, Assistant Project Officer at the Office of the Representative of Freedom of the Media, we will be facilitating this event. Over the next 2 hours, we will have the opportunity to have an open exchange of views on the current environment in which journalists and media actors across the OSCE region operate. Our today's event has 2 aims. On one hand, it will touch upon the most pressing challenges related to the safety of journalists in the OSCE region today, with a particular emphasis on the safety of female journalists online. On the other hand, it will offer a platform for exchange of good practices and for identifying existing legislative and policy gaps, aiming to address them in a timely and comprehensive manner through important parliamentary functions, mainly the legislative oversight and budgeting powers. Before we begin, allow me to point out that today's web dialogue builds upon the questionnaire on the safety of female journalists online, which was shared during the 2022 OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Winter Meeting and ahead of this event. My colleagues from the Representative of Freedom of Media will talk more about it, and we would like to thank all members for taking the time to fill out this questionnaire. It helped greatly to understand national perspectives, which were crucial in the preparation of today's event, as well as for the ensuing activities. Before we begin, Julia, would you perhaps like to give a brief overview of the technical aspects before we move to the agenda?
Sure, many thanks, Ilias, and good afternoon from Vienna, and welcome also from our side. You probably all received the agenda, but maybe just briefly let me inform you about the structure of today's event. So we will have opening remarks by Johan Büser, the rapporteur of the Parliamentary Assembly's Third Committee, and Teresa Ribeiro, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media. Then we will move to the expert presentations, where we will first have Barbara Trionfi, the executive director of the International Press Institute, focusing on the online safety hazard for female journalists and media actors, and then followed by Paulina Guterres from Article 19 and John Whittingdale, head of the UK delegation to the OSCE-PA, where we will hopefully hear a lot about good practices. And then we hope for a very lively debate with all of you to develop together a roadmap for parliamentary action. We will then have conclusions by Hedy Fry, the PA's special representative on gender issues, and we'll close with hopefully a look forward to more preventive and protective mechanisms for the digital safety of women journalists. So as you have probably already noticed, we record this event, but this is only for internal purposes because we will develop an outcome document that we will of course share with all of you just to facilitate it internally. The event will be held in English only, but as already mentioned, we really hope for active participation. So please do share your experiences and national initiatives, good practices, or also the challenges you identify. And if you want to take the floor, please indicate so via the chat. And maybe I will use this opportunity to also kindly ask everybody to mute themselves unless we give you the floor, and then we very much look forward to hear from you. As we hope for in debate, we would kindly ask you to intervene for only 3 minutes, so we really are able to have a conversation and a discussion among all of us. So with that, I will hand back the floor to the PA. Thank you and welcome once again.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks for all the remarks. Without further delay, it's my pleasure to give the floor to the rapporteur of the Assembly's third committee and head of the Swedish delegation to the Assembly, Mr. Johan Buser. Mr. Buser, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ilias. And let me start by saying, distinguished guests, fellow parliamentarians, dear colleagues, it is a true pleasure to open today's important event as the rapporteur of the OSCE PA Third General Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions. This joint web dialogue is a result of a long-standing and fruitful cooperation between the OSCE PA and the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media. Having this in mind, I would like to warmly greet Ms. Teresa Ribeiro, the representative on freedom of the media in OSCE, who will shortly join me in providing opening remarks. I would also like to greet our distinguished guest, Ms. Barbara Trionfi, Executive Director of the International Press Institute, and Ms. Paulina Gutierrez, Legal Officer at Article 19, who will provide us with their expert views on the most relevant issues female journalists are facing nowadays in the online environment. Their views and ideas on how we parliamentarians can contribute to ensuring a safe environment for the journalists, both online and offline, are most welcome. I would also like to greet my distinguished fellow parliamentarians, Dr. Hedi Fry, the OSCE PA Special Representative on Gender Issues, and Mr. Jan Whittingdale, Head of the UK Delegation of the OSCE PA, whose presentations will give us a particular parliamentary perspective of the issue we are discussing today. Dear Heidi, dear John, your work and background are extremely valued and appreciated. Allow me also to inform you that although President Cederfelt is unable to attend today as she is currently on a work trip, she shares her warm regards to the speakers and members, noting the relevance of the topic in light of the war in Ukraine and for the need of parliamentarians to enhance their efforts to ensure the safety of journalists both online and offline. So, dear colleagues, this event is a start of a joint initiative between our two OSCE institutions focusing on safety of female journalists online. The two institutions have partnered up to bring together their valuable experience in addressing this key issue. On one hand, the representative of freedom of the media provides us with their expert knowledge, useful tools, and comprehensive guides to ensure safety of journalists. On the other, OSCE PA offers a unique platform for dialogue for parliamentarians from several participating states to discuss how the parliamentary powers, legislative oversight, and budgeting can be best utilized in this regard. Having this in mind, today's first event will provide an opportunity for a more general discussion on the latest trends and developments with regards to this topic in the vast OSCE region. It will try to identify main issues in ensuring safety of female journalists online. And the second event, which we hope to hold in person this summer, will be of a more technical nature. It will aim to provide concrete best practices, an overview of the tools and concepts, steps to be taken by parliamentarians to make sure that each and every journalist feels safe and free while performing their important duty. Dear colleagues, safety of journalists is an important topic, a topic we must keep high on the agendas in our national parliaments, as well as at the events organized by different international organizations and international parliamentarian fora, such as OSCE PA. Against this backdrop, as public officials, we truly have an enhanced capacity to raise the profile of this important topic, Doing so is vital, because a threat to the journalists is a threat to our democracies and common values, which we all hold very dear. It is indeed a threat to all of us, and we must take it seriously. As the rapporteur of the OSCE PA Third Committee, I included this important issue in the resolution, which I hope to bring forward at the next annual session in Birmingham in the year of 2022. And in the draft text, I discussed the dangers faced by journalists in many places who are increasingly facing harassment. This is particularly relevant for women journalists. Here, as in other areas, I encourage the full use of the OSCE tools. It is also crucial that we recognize that consumption of media and information has changed in modern times, and we must ensure that our legislation and regulations are appropriate to ensure a well-informed population. This includes issues related to, but goes beyond, disinformation. Let me now give you some short information about the situation in my country, in Sweden. Sweden was the world's first country to adopt a press freedom law in 1766. Sweden ranks among those that most respect media independence and has a media ombudsman to address complaints and ethical issues. But that doesn't mean that journalists aren't subjected to threats, online hatred, and gag suits. Female journalists are, of course, more vulnerable in this perspective in general. Media ownership is also very concentrated, with 6 owners controlling more than 90% of the daily press in the country. And also, in 2020, Swedish media and journalists were attacked by the Chinese embassy over issues linked to human rights. Journalists from, for example, Iran are living in self-imposed exile in Sweden, and they were also the targets of threats and attacks from their countries of origin. David Isaac, a journalist with Swedish and Eritrean dual citizenship, has been jailed without a trial in Eritrea since the year of 2001. And no other journalist in the world has been detained for such a long time just for doing his job. And an author and publisher with Swedish and Chinese dual citizenship, Gui Minhai, has been in prison since 2015 in China, where he has been sentenced for 10 years in prison. Changes in the media sector accelerated as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Print media are going online, and their economic model is switching from advertising to subscription. A fall in advertising earnings created financial difficulties for several media, and state subsidies more than doubled. But the pandemic also increased interest in the news, with Swedish society seeing the importance of factual, relevant reporting. And in the past years, the number of female journalists and related professionals in Sweden was almost always higher than the amount of male employees in this field. In 2020, 4,700 journalists were women, while the number of males working as journalists was 4,400. So that was a little short information about the situation in Sweden. Dear colleagues, I am particularly looking forward now to hearing from different OSCE PA members and delegations on what kind of issues are relevant for their respective countries. We all come from different environments, and it is natural that we also encounter different challenges. That is why I would like to encourage all participants to actively contribute to this debate that we are going to have. I truly believe that exchanges such as this one are crucial. Not only do we get to understand different issues we are facing when it comes to the safety of journalists, we also have an opportunity to give each other advice and together find appropriate solutions. Therefore, I will stop here and conclude by saying that I'm truly looking forward to the discussion and all upcoming activities. And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Teresa Ribeiro, the representative on freedom of the media. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buz, and thank you for your remarks. I think without further delay, I can give the floor to Julia for a short introduction of the representative before we pass immediately to her remarks. Julia, you have the floor.
Thank you. So yes, I mean, I don't think that the representative will need a lengthy introduction, but I can share with you that Teresa Ribeiro, she's the 5th representative on freedom of the media, and prior to that position, she was Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Portugal, while serving as President of the National Commission for Human Rights. She was also Secretary of State for European Affairs at the Ministry and Deputy Secretary General at the Union of the Mediterranean. Also, she has held different positions in media, both in Portugal and in multilateral organizations, such as President of the Institute of the Media of Portugal, President of the Steering Committee on Mass Media of the Council of Europe, and co-founder and first President of the Executive Board of OSCE Media Observatory. With this, Ms. Ribeiro, please, you have the floor.
It's muted. Ms. Ribeiro, I think you're muted. I think now it's
Yes,
fixed.
okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Thank you, and sorry for this small delay. Dear members of the Parliament, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure to welcome you today at this joint web dialogue on the safety of female journalists online, soft show. I'm very pleased to see so many MPs here today, together with our excellent speakers, to start an open debate on parliamentary action to improve prevention and protection mechanisms for women journalists. As parliamentarians, I know that you are well aware that democratic participation is possible only where everyone can access and express a diversity of information. The free flow of information and ideas is one of the basic principles of freedom of expression. And without diversity or pluralism, there can be no democracy. Just as without media freedom, there can be no security, which is my office slogan for this year's 25th anniversary of the mandate of the representative on freedom of media. It's not a slogan, but a substantive statement that really reflects the reality of the challenges we are facing today. Equal opportunities to free speech for all is indispensable for genuine media freedom and is the basis for peace, comprehensive security, and sustainable development. In reality, however, we see that journalists face repression, restrictions, and restraint. And we see that intimidation, threats, and violence come from both state and private actors, that they are perpetrated online as well as offline. The online sphere poses a plethora of challenges to the safety of journalists, with female journalists being particularly targeted because of their work and because of their gender. And if we look at the types of threats faced, it becomes clear that they are intersect with other identities or specific characteristics that can add layers of discrimination and further increase the risks of online hate, targeted disinformation campaign, and other attacks. The 2020 UNESCO-wide CFJ study confirms 2 out of 3 women journalists experience online attacks. 2/3 of all women journalists. The study also shows that 20% of physical abuse is linked to prior online attacks. Online harassment and abuse are a problem in and of itself, but they are also pathways leading to physical attacks and violence offline and create an atmosphere of fear and censorship. I am grateful that Barbara Triumphi is with us today to tell us more about the online safety hazards women journalists and media actors face today. Gender-based online attacks regularly aim at denying women a public voice, leading to self-censorship or even women retreating from the public sphere, depriving society of diverse information and inclusive public debates. This clearly contradicts pluralism and media freedom. For this reason, this year's joint declaration of the free speech mandate holders will focus on freedom of expression and gender justice. It will be launched next month at the World Press Freedom Day, and we will share it with all of you. My office has promoted the safety of female journalists online through its Soft Jaw project since 2015, and recently published a comprehensive resource guide with proposed actions for key actors, including parliamentarians, complemented by good practice examples and additional resources. I'm glad that one of the authors, Paulina Gutierrez of Article 19, joined us today to also present some of the examples in implementing media freedom commitments with a gender perspective. While I'm convinced that we need a whole of society approach to address the challenges, parliamentarians do have a fundamental role in ensuring that freedom of expression is enabled for all, including through regulatory responses and by holding governments to account, by addressing harassment and inappropriate behavior by politicians and public figures, and by ensuring adequate, timely, and effective prevention, protection, and prosecution mechanisms. In 2018, all OSCE participating states committed themselves to improve the safety of journalists, including by adding a gender perspective to all efforts. And the MC decision is clear that safety is a broad concept. It does not only mean the absence of physical harm, but also entails working conditions, legal, economic, and psychological aspects, and of course, digital safety. Today's event and this joint initiative with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly will help us get one step closer towards closing the implementation gap when it comes to the online safety of women journalists. Let us use the opportunity to exchange good practices, to identify common challenges, and to discuss possible responses. I'm very pleased that Joan Wissingale is joining us today to tell us about the UK example, one of the very few OSCE countries that have already adopted a national action plan on the safety of journalists, and which also includes a gender perspective. I am sure your experiences of both the process and the substance of the UK Action Plan will be incredibly informative to today's discussions. Also the soft jaw questionnaire sent out during the PA's winter session has provided some important fast indications of the challenges many of you identify in improving the safety of journalists. The survey will continue to be accessible via the link just put in the chat. And I encourage all of you who did not yet participate to also share your experience so they can inform our next steps and we can better target our support. It is important to hear from all of you today in this first open debate to hear about your concerns, experiences, and challenges, as well as about your initiatives and success stories. You, as parliamentarians, are an essential building block for improving the situation of women journalists and thus of media pluralism across our region. Let's together build better prevention and protection mechanisms for the female journalists in our region. I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much for that opening remarks, and thank you also for underlining that there are clear international commitments also from a gender perspective, and that there is a need for a parliamentary debate and parliamentary action to close the implementation gap that we have. So let's now move to actually this debate and to the next part of today's agenda. And thereby to our first expert speaker, who will provide us with a little bit more insight on the online safety hazard for female journalists and media actors. And also who will explain to us what gender-based online violence leads to from the perspective of plurality of voices and access to information. And also which steps the media community itself would consider very useful from parliamentarians and others to ensure safer, more pluralistic and more inclusive media and information spaces. So we will now hear from Barbara Trionfi, who is Executive Director of the International Press Institute, which is a global network of editors, media executives, and leading journalists dedicated to safeguarding and fostering media freedom and promoting quality independent journalism. Previously, Barbara led IPI's global press freedom monitoring, global advocacy. She has also field experience and an academic background in international relations and human rights. Moreover, Barbara and IPI more generally have been long-standing partners of our office and specifically of the Software Project, where we have, among many other things, also jointly produced a documentary, Our Dark Place, on the impact of online harassment and attacks by highlighting the stories of different women journalists from across the OSCE region. Barbara, we are very excited to have you here. Thank you for joining, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Julia. And first of all, many thanks to the members of the Parliamentary Assembly and Mr. Busa for having me here today. And also many thanks to the OSCE representative and her office that have been really a leading voice in the fight against online attacks. The fight against online attacks against journalists for a few years now, and it has been always a pleasure for IPI to work closely with the Office of the Representative on this topic. So IPI's focus on the issue of online attacks against journalists started approximately 7 to 8 years ago, when some of our members around the world started reporting to us this type of fairly new phenomenon back then. And our work has focused initially in understanding the nature of these attacks, and as well as understanding the consequences both on journalists and on society at large. And of course, most recently on understanding what we can do against it, what can be done against it, both from an industry perspective, from the perspective of the journalistic community, but certainly also from the perspective of the states, the legislative and judicial branches of the states. So, first of all, of course, for many years, the effort was to explain and ensure that people appreciate the fact that online attacks are not, are serious attacks, are not something, first of all, they tend to not remain isolated to the online sphere. We have seen enough journalists, even in Europe, even in the OSCE region, that have received online attacks for years, and these turned eventually into physical attacks. But secondly, and this is what I will try to explain today a little bit, is how much they really affect the work of journalists, how much they prevent the ability of journalists to cover certain topics, and how much they affect society and at large, and the democratic framework of our countries. First of all, let me start by telling that online attacks are never to be considered isolated events. Is not there, and they cannot be seen that way, even if from the point of view of those on the receiving side, that's how they look like. You know, I write an article and then I receive isolated insults, threats, various forms of attacks by somebody out there through online platforms, so social media platforms typically. However, IPI's analysis and further studies also besides of IPI's have shown that this is part of a much more complex phenomenon. Is part very often online attacks are part of what we call coordinated campaigns. There is somebody in a position of power, somebody who has an interest in silencing the voices of journalists that is behind these attacks. And there is a very clear structure. In most of these attacks, there is a very clear structure in place whereby the person who has an interest in silencing a critical voice, an investigative voice, or a voice of a journalist, launches an attack, which is disseminated further by a circle of what we would call paid aggressors. Some call them trolls, anyway, with the support, of course, of bots, so of machines, and this goes further until it becomes viral. Until it becomes viral, and then it spreads into the community. And there is the point where, of course, everybody out there feels that she or he is legitimate to attack the journalist just because. But I think it is important to see that these attacks are intentional. It's not somebody who didn't like the way I write, but there is somebody who has an intention to silence me. And secondly, what we also have seen these attacks very often happen is in authoritarian contexts, even in the OSCE region, you know, in countries where there are a number of other restrictions in place that limit the freedom of the press. Additionally to all of that, online harassment is being adopted to further challenge the credibility of those few independent voices that remain available in the journalistic community. So why do we focus on women? And as Mr. Buser has highlighted also, is really the attacks tend to focus, well, every type of journalist, every gender, every journalist, most journalists receive these types of online attacks. Indeed, the attacks that target women and members of minorities tend to be more vicious, more difficult to deal with, also from an individual perspective. And the reason for that is just that it is easier, because these attacks take advantage of the existing sexism, the existing racism, the existing discriminatory tendencies that are within our societies, and that are unfortunately so much more present on social media, and that are even incentivized by the algorithms in order to ensure that they become viral. So in order to ensure that an attack against the journalist is viral, most likely the attacker will focus on issues related to gender, and to race, or to diversity anyway. And that's why women are targeted more than others, and members of minorities, of course. How do these attacks look like? So of course, there are many. I think it's also important to consider there are many forms of attacks. They go from death threats to other forms of threats against the families, friends, the colleagues, but also they look like insults, heavy criticism, and this is what makes them even more difficult to address, because as journalists, obviously, we are expected to be subject to criticism, and that's how it should be. That's part of the type of exchange that should exist in society. However, when does this criticism go as far and becomes an insult, and becomes an online attack, and becomes something that challenges not only myself as a journalist, but something that challenges our society as a whole. And that's the most important aspect. That's the biggest challenge in order to develop mechanisms to counter these attacks. Which one of those so that's another thing that we also need to take into consideration, that very often the insults are not isolated posts or messages. Very often they are part of campaigns. So it's not one form of insult, one form of, but it's a mixture of, and on the receiving side, the journalist sees just the floods of hate messages coming towards her or him. And that's what has this terrifying effect, because the journalists never know also when will this turn into a physical attack, but also because a lot of these attacks challenge the credibility of the journalists themselves. They will, they will talk about also how the journalists would be receiving money from some part, and that's why they should not be credible, why the journalist is involved with some organization, and that. So they're very much aimed at challenging the credibility by spreading information that is not correct. So, and that's the other aspect that I also wanted to highlight. Online attacks are not only a part and parcel of efforts by authoritarian governments, but are also the flip side of the phenomenon of disinformation. So anybody who is beyond efforts towards disinformation, towards spreading disinformation, they are also very often using online attacks to challenge the credibility of those that are the sources of actual information. So these two also go hand in hand. And in that sense, I wanted to really highlight how complicated this issue is. So what are the consequences of these attacks? There are consequences on society, as I mentioned. They challenge the trust in journalism. Similarly to disinformation, they challenge the ability of society out there to distinguish between journalism and other forms of opinions or other forms of information that may or may not have been verified. And they basically aim at placing information that is accurately verified journalistic research on the same level as somebody's opinion, which is obviously a very dangerous pattern. So it has consequences for society. It has consequences for the media outlets, even economic consequences. In many countries, we know that the media industry, the business models have been weakened by the fact that a lot of the advertisers have moved to the social media platforms, and media companies have developed methods to survive which are based on monetizing audiences. So a lot of their revenue comes from readers, from audiences. Now, in the moment that the credibility of the media outlet is being challenged among their audiences, these will stop paying their subscriptions, their membership, their donations, anything they give to the media outlet. And this, in the end, has a strong economic impact on news organizations. This is even more true in countries where news organizations are already struggling because of a restrictive climate. So online attacks tend to also serve as in order to kill the last few independent voices in terms of the industry. And finally, the consequences on the journalists themselves. The journalists who, as I said, they normally tend to be women, they tend to be members of minorities, however, members of part of groups that are already subject to different forms of discrimination in society. And this comes on top of all of that. And very often the outcome is self-censorship. So basically we spoke with many journalists who say, I don't cover certain topics because I know that if I do, I will be flooded with these type of threats, attacks against my family, my kids, and all of that, and I can't deal with that. So a self-censorship is a loss of voices, is a loss of diversity of the voices that we have in covering hard topics, because then women and members of minority will tend to cover so-called soft topics, lifestyle, things that do not attract so much criticism. So we lose the diversity of sources of information and the diversity of voices. And and finally, we lose very often voices in journalism itself. People just, change profession because it becomes just too difficult to bear. So what can we do? What needs to be done? What can parliamentarians do? And on this, certainly, I would like also to refer to the resource guide, which the OSCE, the Office of the OSCE representative has produced, which is an excellent reference in terms of identifying which policies have worked and which one not. Sorry, I just want to highlight the challenge of promoting legislative mechanisms to counter online attacks. And the problem is, as I said, in the moment we develop and implement laws that or limit free expression too much in order to limit online attacks, we run the risk of limiting journalism itself, or we run the risk of offering opportunities for those in authoritarian context to develop and implement laws that limit independent journalism. So we have seen this happening, for example, in the case of disinformation. We have seen how so-called anti-fake news laws, anti-disinformation laws have been abused almost exclusively in order to silence critical voices. Because who is to decide what is disinformation and what is actual news? And very often this decision is left in the hands of those who have an interest in silencing critical voices. So the concern is that any laws that limits free expression on social media will eventually not only limit online attacks, but also challenge free expression. So how can we look at this? First of all, I think from IPI's point of view, there is the need to ensure that existing laws are implemented with an understanding of the problem. So trainings of police, training of the judicial authorities, and so on, in order to make sure that if a journalist reports a death threats, for example, the journalist will be taken seriously and this will be investigated by the authorities, and it should be, and will not just simply be dismissed because it's just happening online. So implementing and making sure that existing laws that we have for the protection against death and so on and are implemented properly. What we have also seen is some multi-stakeholders mechanisms working very well in this context. IPI has worked quite closely with the press safety, I think it's called Persveilig in the Netherlands, which is really a safety mechanisms that is multi-stakeholders. It includes a representative of police, of the prosecutor office, of press associations, and so on. And whenever they receive complaints from journalists, they bring those to the attention of the authorities in charge and ensure that these are followed up in a way that ensures that the perpetrators are brought to justice whenever possible, but also does not limit the work of journalists. So multi-stakeholder mechanisms are very important. And finally, just my final remark is we need to look at how we can support the journalistic community itself to create support mechanisms within newsrooms and within journalistic association. And this is something that IPI has been looking into and has been developing, but very often they're fairly resource intensive, and certainly there is the need for more support there. Thank you very much. I leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Barbara. There is so much, I think, to unpack already here. Maybe just as a very, very brief summary for me, it was really excellent how you explained the different layers of this phenomenon, how it really impacts the individual journalist who is targeted, the freedom of expression of herself. But then also it has this additional layer of coordination, the gender perspective, this element of power and the interest to silencing critical and investigating voices. And then there's even the third layer of freedom of the media, of plurality of voices and trust in journalism and access to information. So this was really, really important, I think, to recognize that there is an impact on all these different levels, and which is an additional reason why we really need to address it. And also the second issue that I found very relevant was that there must be no trade-off between really the safety online or safety generally of journalists and the free flow of information, and that censorship or limiting information cannot be the solution. Thanks also for pointing already to our resource guide, which is really an excellent transition already to our next speaker, because I think also being cautious of the time, we will keep the questions for later. And I would now hand over to our next speaker and go to the second element of this event, where we will look at good practices and experiences to really address all the issues that you have now so eloquently laid out, and the challenges and complexity of the issues. So I would like to hand over the floor to Paulina Guterres from Article 19, who is an international human rights lawyer and strategy advisor, digital rights and gender equality advocate, and who leads the civic space and protection portfolio in the law and policy program at Article 19. She has experience leading freedom of expression and non-discrimination projects, and legally represented also victims of gross human rights violations, including women journalists, before court. Moreover, she has, together with her colleagues Silvia Cocharo and Sarah Clark, authored the Soft Resource Guide that we have heard about now by Ms. Ribeiro, but also Ms. Trionfi, and which is really our main publication, providing proposed actions to close the implementation gap when it comes to the digital safety of women journalists. It provides guidance on who should do what, but also how to do it, really by compiling good practices. And it addresses chapters specifically to parliamentarians. So it is very great to have you with us, Paulina, and we're very much looking forward to hearing more about the resource guide, the good practices, etc. from your side. So thank you, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you for the invitation to the representative of the freedom of the media, to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So first of all, let us also thank again to the Office of the Representative of the Freedom of the Media for counting on us to develop this resource guide on the online safety of women journalists, because I think it's a good response to exactly what Barbara just brilliantly explained on how this is a phenomenon that is impacting not only at the individual scope and ambit of the life of women journalists, but also freedom of expression as a whole. So this is exactly one of our key approaches that we used while we were developing this guide. So let me divide my presentation in two sections. So one will be about what is this underlying approach that we used to develop the resource guide, and you will find throughout the sections, and some key concepts, but then also what are the specific proposed actions to parliamentarians and legislative branches in every country. So when we're talking about the approach, you will find in the guide that we try to address the issue from a comprehensive approach that covers prevention, protection, and remedy. And that's why we identified a wide number of stakeholders, because under this approach, it can be helpful to identify who has a role to play and how can they implement and actionate this role. It's under this approach that we decided also to find the intersection with women's right, not only to freedom of expression, but to non-discrimination and equality, because this is a gap that has been needed to join when developing policy approaches, legislative approaches. And I think that one of the proposed actions that are in this resource guide the challenges that Barbara already mentioned. And it is exactly under the second section of the resource guide where we find these proposed actions directed to parliamentarians and the legislative branch. But first of all, as you were saying, Julia, so the guide is aiming to fill this gap from theory and converting it into practice. It is exactly how we decided also to start problematizing a little bit more the concept of online harassment and abuse, online violence, because a wide number of concepts are being used. And while there is no need to have a one defining everything that falls under these like more umbrellas concepts, Barbara already mentioned, there are various manifestations, and a legislative or a parliamentarian approach requires to make these specific distinctions to identify what is the right that is being affected, what is the impact, what is the need, and to assess exactly what's under each and every manifestation. And of course, this approach that is a multi-stakeholder approach, including this perspective of non-discrimination and equality of women, is how we developed these specific practices that would respond to a gender-responsive approach that has been widely used in different international treaties, resolutions, and many other documents, but we thought that there was no specific link on what this meant. So this is like the underlying approach that we used for the resource guide. I'm going now into the proposed actions. So in the resource guide, you will find this section too. Like the first proposed action covers exactly the review and when necessary, amend or adopt laws to promote a gender-responsive approach to the safety of journalists. So it is exactly under this proposed action that responds to the challenge that Barbara mentioned, that before responding directly to create new legislative frameworks, new laws, or any specific, even when it, because we have seen in many countries that they try to bring new criminal offenses, for example, and they are using back concepts that tend to be counterproductive to the freedom of expression of the people and the groups, in this case, women journalists that are trying to protect. So before going into that issues, it's important to review the existing framework and where are the flaws, and also to see if this framework is capable to respond to the new manifestations that become serious or less serious and respond accordingly without the need to respond immediately with criminal offenses. So that is one thing. And let me bring you a very quick example where we found, and you will find it in the resource guide, where there are different, it's actually in the document, the report of legal responses on online harassment and abuse, where that was developed by IPI for the Office of the Representative of the Media, where you can identify what are the laws that are being used to address some of the manifestations of this abuse. And some of the things that was identified there was, for example, that they were using criminal defamation to address one of the cases. While at the same time, you will see that there's like a general international consensus on the need to decriminalize. In other cases, we have identified, like, for example, they are reviewing the specific death threats crimes. And sometimes these offenses can be sufficient to cover some of the manifestations that occur online. But in other cases, there may be some element. For example, when the prosecutors are finding obstacles to do not prosecute or follow or initiate investigations ex officio. This means that the person needs to come and present a complaint. So sometimes that has been the specific obstacle for very serious manifestations of online abuse and harassment. So exactly in this point of amend, and when necessary, review, and when necessary, adopt, it needs to be a very careful assessment on the impacts that these laws could have or new legislative approaches could have. And this brings us to the second action proposal, which is like all the legislation addressing online harassment and abuse against women journalists does not, need to make sure that they do not undermine the right to freedom of expression and privacy. And this is something that is perfectly understood under the approach that every legislation that may imply a restriction to the right to freedom of expression on the basis of online harassment and abuse against women needs to be treated as such, as a restriction to freedom of expression, and that's why it needs to comply with the three-part test of legitimacy, necessity, and proportionality. And one of the important aspects of these approaches to develop freedom of expression compliant legislations involve also making sure that it is only the most serious cases that end up strictly regulated, but also that we have other options and remedies for example, when we talk about civil and administrative measures, or also when we want to focus more on creating these multi-stakeholder groups. I mean, the parliamentary body and legislative branches can play a role in setting a legislative framework for these groups to happen. And there are also examples where these laws, for example, come to create like more robust frameworks on human rights institutions, equality institutions, and how they can connect the issue of safety of journalists with equality and non-discrimination. So this is how we have found as well that in this guide there are a lot. I mean, there are a series of examples of how using back concepts may have these counterproductive effects on freedom of expression. But also how maybe even having these restrictive approaches, using hate speech as a broad concept, criminal defamation as a broad concept, is going against international freedom of expression standards. Also because talking about technology and the use of technology need to be ensured and seen as a positive factor of exercising the right and how women journalists use technology to exercise their journalistic freedom of expression. Because some of other examples we have identified is that criminal legislation or any other type of legislation try to put the focus on the problem of using technology, which is a means of expression, rather than focusing on the serious and aggravating circumstances that can bring in each case. For example, as Barbara was mentioning, whenever there is an attack, and then you will have some gender factors, and then you will also have other intersectional factors, which may include ethnicity and many other national and racial elements that will interact with the attack, and that would be better to start looking at that elements that could bring some seriousness threshold to the attack instead of trying to focus on the problems that the technology has brought in this specific issue. And this is particularly for the purposes of legislative action and not looking at intermediaries and many other private practices that are definitely supporting and promoting these viral attacks. So if you look into this section of the guidelines, you can also identify like there are various very good examples about how to use existing laws. For example, where there is you will find an example in Ireland where they have been using existing harassment laws. And they will also, I mean, the charge was brought under this existing law, non-fatal offenses against the person, and enable the prosecution of individuals for harassment by any means. So there's no need to talk about technology and many others because it will be difficult to get the pace through the developments, but it's important just to make sure that some of these existing legislations are able to respond. So it is also important because many of the things that could happen when trying to regulate or to legislate on the issue and the different manifestations, the main obstacles that could be found are more on the implementation of those existing ones, but also on the obstacles of the prosecutorial measures. That's why when we're developing the underlying approach of the guide, we thought that as everyone is connected and has a play to role, there's no only one measure that will solve this specific problem. And that's why it's so important that whenever a state and a parliament or a legislative body wants to start a discussion of a new law or amending a law for addressing this issue, women journalists need to be involved, civil society need to be involved. There needs to be a consultation that ensures that the different views and the different consequences of legislating on these matters are covered, but also to provide and identify how non-legislative measures could also help in addressing the issue. So I think that talking about all these different, how to make sure that legislation is compliant, how to treat this phenomenon as a thing that also impacts and it's exacerbated by discrimination and inequality against women, and also how to build this framework under this very broad obligation of enabling of creating an enabling environment for women journalists. But this is not only for their safety, but also to ensure that they are able to contribute to public debate. Because this is how we end up thinking about the specific approaches that we can think about whenever there is a complete, to identify the gaps and also to complete the process that would justify any more, let's see, I don't want to call it restrictive, but whenever there need to be a specific justification when legislation is complying with all these elements to restrict certain types of expression. When it comes to criminal defamation, this has been an important, I don't know, it's a challenge more than an issue, because in many countries, it's like the first, or it has become the first resort. It has been the first way to address many types of attacks online, and it's a good practice as well to prevent the overuse of these laws, particularly if they are criminal defamation laws, and start looking at what are the specific manifestations that can fall under other laws, or in case there's need to discuss, and as I said, under a broad consultation of what needs to be done. So I think we can discuss about the very specific examples that the resource guide has, but I think we can go into that detail if there are some questions or more specific questions. So I will be very happy to receive them, and I hope this conversation help us fulfill the aim of this resource guide, to fill the gap on the theory and practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paulina. I mean, again, I think there were so many very, very relevant aspects and very technical proposals as well, which is incredibly useful. Maybe also here just to point out two issues that I found particularly important is, of course, that you underlined that we need regulatory responses, but that they can only be important and effective if they're done and implemented properly, but that we also often see that they're used as pretext for censorship, or that also sometimes there are unintended restrictive impacts that can be counterproductive. Moreover, I also think it was very important to hear that when we speak about technology and about this digital sphere and the online perspective, that we really need to focus on the reach and not the speech. So really on the processes of amplification and the underlying business practices. So with this kind of like knowing or underlining again that there, unfortunately, to such a complex and challenging issue, there is no silver bullet or kind of like one solution that can fix it. That brings me back to also what the representatives said in the beginning. We really need a whole of society approach and a variety of measures to enable this enabling environment for inclusive public participation. So thank you very much. And with that, I will hand over back to Ilias and the PA.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you also, Ms. Triomfi and Ms. Gutierrez, for your very interesting presentations. Also thought-provoking in terms of finding appropriate solutions that do not go, they do not target only one thing, but they go more broadly. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the head of the United Kingdom delegation to the OSCE, Mr. John Whittingdale, who is a British politician serving as Member of Parliament for Malton since 1992. His expertise and background are much appreciated in our today's discussion, as Mr. Whittingdale has also served as Minister for Media and Data and as a co-chair of the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists. So without further ado, Mr. Whittingdale, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be able to join the discussion this afternoon. As you said, I've twice had responsibility in government for media, and the issue around protection of journalists, the safety of journalists, is one which we have given a very high priority, because obviously, as we all recognize, media freedom is an essential part of a free society, and many journalists are risking their lives, particularly now. And I would like just to reference the bravery that we are seeing of journalists in Ukraine at the moment. Sadly, 6 have lost their lives, 2 of which were women. But we decided that media freedom generally we would wish to promote internationally. And so the UK, as many on the discussion will know, in July 2019 hosted the first global conference on media freedom. We hosted it jointly with Canada, and we established the Global Coalition for Media Freedom. That has continued since that time, and I'm delighted that we now have 50 member countries of that, and the latest conference was held in Estonia in February earlier this year. But whilst the UK is not necessarily as dangerous a place for journalists to practice as some other parts of the world, nevertheless, I was very much aware that journalists in the UK are subject to a lot of the threats, the harassment, intimidation, and particularly women journalists. And it disturbed me that the UK is rated at the moment as 33 out of 180 by the Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index. So it was to address that we established a national committee for the safety of journalists in 2020. And that committee brought together representatives of our policing authorities, of our prosecuting authorities, those responsible for bringing cases against people accused of harassing journalists through the courts. We also had representatives of both editors and journalists, and also the campaigning organizations like Index on Censorship and Reporters Without Borders. And that led to the drawing up of an action plan, which we published in March of last year. And the main elements of that were the need to, first of all, increase our understanding of the scale of the problem. And so following it, we did immediately publish a call for evidence in which we issued a questionnaire inviting journalists from across Britain to tell us of their own experience. And I want to come back and tell you a little bit about what that found. But we also looked at ways in which we could enhance the criminal justice system by having training for police officers, and in some forces dedicated officers who would be the point of contact for any journalists wishing to report threats or criminal activity against them. We also look to the employers of journalists, the newspapers and broadcasters, to give greater attention to the problems faced by their journalists with legal advice and resources to what actions they should take. We in particular talk to the online platforms who were hosting a lot of the material which was threatening to journalists. So we got a commitment from Twitter and Facebook and others that they would act swiftly against any complaints of abusive language or threats posted on their sites. And again, I want to come back to the role of the online platforms. And we also recognized there was a need to improve the public awareness of the importance and value of journalism, because too often journalists are not highly regarded, and people, I think, do not fully understand the important role they play. But as I say, we launched that call for evidence, which reported in November of last year. It found we had 360 responses. It wasn't a huge sample, but nevertheless, 360 journalists who did respond. 4 out of 5 said that they had experienced threats or abuse or violence. And we also found that a larger proportion of female journalists, that was over 1 in 3, felt that they did not feel safe in doing their job. They reported that violence and abuse were common. Bullying was especially prevalent online, and that was something which female journalists were particularly subjected to. And we heard directly from several female journalists who had experienced, in some cases, death threats, in particular one who had been reporting in Northern Ireland, but also others who'd experienced consistent threats of violence against them or their children in one particular case. And indeed from a young female journalist working for the BBC who'd actually left the profession as a result of the stress and harassment. So it raises the question of what parliaments can do. We, first of all, have a regular debate in Parliament around press freedom. We try and coincide it with World Press Freedom Day, so we'll be having another one in a few weeks' time in which MPs from all parties can speak about the importance of protection of journalists. But more specifically, we actually introduced a piece of legislation yesterday, which is now being debated by Parliament, which we have called the Online Safety Bill. It is designed to address all of the harmful activities which are either unregulated or insufficiently controlled on the internet. And in particular, it places additional responsibilities on what we've called the Category 1 platforms. Those are the large ones like Twitter, like Snapchat, like Facebook, like Google. This will also include search engines. And they have a duty of care, and that will mean that they are required to act against any content which is either illegal, that such as child sexual exploitation or fraud, but also categories of content which we have described as legal but harmful. In particular, that will include harmful communications. Now, Barbara earlier rightly raised the issue about the protection of freedom of speech, and there is a balance to be drawn between preventing harmful content being posted, but at the same time not restricting freedom of speech. And therefore we built into the legislation a requirement on the platforms to have regard for freedom of speech, and also to give particular protection for journalistic content. And so content that is posted or shared, which comes from recognized professional journalism, has got special protection. It is not the websites of professional journalistic publications are not covered by the legislation, and the platforms like Facebook are required to recognize that professional journalistic content does require special protection. It doesn't mean that if they feel it breaches their terms and conditions, they can't take it down, but they have to justify their reasons for doing so. But the bill is designed to address a problem which obviously, as we've heard, is affecting female journalists particularly, but not just journalists. I can say that a large number of my colleagues, female colleagues in Parliament, are also subject to regular abuse and threats, and in some cases really serious threats of violence. That is, of course, against the law, and we have had some successful prosecutions. But the purpose of this bill is to place the responsibility on the platform so that they cannot just say that they have no responsibility for what is posted on their sites. And therefore they will have a duty of care to act on complaints about malicious communication, those which threaten violence or abusive, and to remove that and to act quickly. And that will now be subject to oversight by the Office of Communications in the UK, which is our regulator. So I think that this is a very difficult area. I think we are one of the first countries to try and address it through legislation. But I believe that there is a very widespread view that it has to be done. And in order to not just protect female journalists, but to protect all citizens who are subject to the kind of abuse which could not be tolerated if it were not taking place offline rather than online. And so I would encourage other member countries of the OSCE to look to see what kinds of measures of this kind they can take, which I hope will have a real practical effect in addressing what is a growing problem, as has been demonstrated by the surveys that have taken place of journalists in the UK. So thank you very much for the opportunity to tell you something of what we're trying to do.
Thank you, sir. It was a real pleasure to be able to listen to your remarks and to learn more about the process that led to the adoption of the UK's National Action Plan, but also your action in your mandate as minister. I'm sure that our participants will find this extremely useful and thought-provoking for their work in their own parliaments. Without further ado, I can pass the floor. I can open the debate, actually, for members who are willing to take the floor. Fortunately, I cannot see any request for the floor now. So maybe we can proceed with some questions to our expert speakers ourselves, and then we can see if anyone else can wish to take the floor. Julia, I think you can. You have indicated something to our experts if you want to take the floor, and I will continue with some questions myself.
Thank you very much. I want to use this power as co-moderator to put our excellent speakers on the spot. And maybe if I mean, I know that the online safety bill is something that has been discussed widely, and I, of course, fully agree also that it is, we are still in this very early phase of also trying to find proper legislatory approaches and responses. And we have seen a fairly similar, though a little bit different approach also in the European Union level with the Digital Services Act and other initiatives on national levels that really try to find solutions by putting further responsibility to act on platforms and on these private actors. So maybe if I may put you, Barbara and Paulina, on the spot to ask you what you think, whether this is, I mean, of course, also platforms and private actors do have as a very important role to play to ensure a safer online environment, but is this something where you think this is the element that has been missing so far and that can really make a difference, or whether this can only be one of the aspects and also the state actors themselves need to take additional regulatory responses to address the issue? Thanks.
Sure. So should I start? Well, you know, it's such a terribly complicated topic. I think that, of course, we, coming from a press freedom organization, we operate in the realm of freedom of expression, and certainly we have. Me in particular, I come from a generation that still considered the internet the space where those who were not allowed to disseminate independent, critical information elsewhere would go to. So we still see today a lot of countries where critical journalists have no other place to disseminate news of public interest but social media platforms. And the concern is, so naturally, obviously IPI wouldn't have particular concerns about the UK implementing a bill like this with the oversight of an institution like the OFCOM that has very strong democratic traditions and a framework and systems of checks and balances and all of that. So that is absolutely something that and similar. This is also the similar approach to the Digital Services Act that you have mentioned, Julia. Obviously, these are excellent initiatives in the moment we consider operating in a democratic environment. The challenge that we see is that very often that they're being borrowed one-to-one by countries that do not have this democratic framework and do not have this democratic approach. And that's where we see the trouble coming. So it's and that's where an organization like IPI would be, as I said, would be very, you know, a lot of warning would, alarm bells would ring in the moment we say this, not because of any concern that we may have about the implementation of these type of bills in a democratic environment, but because we know how this is going to affect other countries and places where journalists and journalism is already being clamped down upon. So now, obviously, from the point of view of a parliamentarian that operates at the national levels, it seems entirely legitimate to say, you know, I operate in the interest of my country, and this is what my country needs. But I do think that we need to still keep this in the back of our head, and keep in mind that these type of bills, although well-intentioned, can be so easily abused in the moment there is a government that intends to use them for the purpose of restrictions free expression. And a more deregulatory approach towards the platforms somehow did serve well the interest of critical voices in autocratic environment. This said, I also think we have come to the point where the damage that is being done by certain trends that we have seen taking place on the platforms is such that is very difficult to argue against. So I think we have come to the point where some type of, it's difficult to argue, you know, we don't want regulation because somebody may abuse it. Because we have seen very, very clearly the damage that that the failure to regulate is doing to our democracies. So sorry, I don't have a straight answer, and I'm very sorry about that. So maybe Paulina will have a much better answer than I do. But this is just to tell you all the difficulty in approaching this.
No, thank you very much. I mean, I think what you pointed out rightly so is that there is an undue power by platforms on the information flow, but we need regulatory responses on that. But that does not mean that we should have control by states or by others over the information flow. But Paulina, I see you unmuted yourself, so please go ahead if you want to add something.
Sure, and let me just agree with what Barbara just said, and adding just a few points into this, because Article 19 has been following very closely the DSA and the Online Safety Bill. And I mean, we have a lot of materials highlighting our concerns and those provisions that we support or are welcoming from the point of view of freedom of expression, international standards. But let me link these two pieces of legislation with what is actually in the resource guide. Because when we are talking about ensuring that any legislative approaches comply with the right to freedom of expression, it involves also making sure, for example, that encryption and anonymity is recognized as under international law, that this is part of freedom of expression. So whenever there are some measures that could put at risk these protections are definitely having or will be highly likely to be undermining the exercise of this right, but also privacy for many users. Another thing that you can also find in the resource guide, and that we have been raising in the context of some of these pieces of legislation, is that some of the measures to ensure safety or to determine if whether a content is legal or not is the general monitoring obligations, which have been recognized I mean, the general monitoring of states is a type of a prohibition, is a standard that is already widely recognized. But this may have the implications of asking the companies to carry out this general monitoring. And this can also have a negative effect into the different uses that not only women journalists and journalists use the technology for, but to denounce human rights abuses, to share live human rights abuses and many other things that the technology is being used to. And also because, of course, I think that this is just also part of many discussions around the world, trying to put companies under more scrutiny and to be accountable for what practices they are taking, which we agree on. But sometimes some parts of our recommendations is to be very cautious about asking platforms to be the ones deciding what is legal and what is not. So whenever we are thinking about this from a freedom of expression perspective, we are talking about approaches that are likely to restrict speech while adjudicating them this power, these private companies. And obviously, sometimes if this will end up into responsibility or liability, this could definitely imply more over removal of content, over monitoring of content, because as far as I understand, they also include private messaging. They could also include private messaging. So for us, it's very important to draw the line, because we are not against the safety and putting scrutiny over the platforms, because they definitely need to respond for the different practices they are carrying out and what they are not doing. But talking about the freedom of expression perspective, that's why it's important to remember and to have in mind every principles and standards that would ensure drawing that line. And because there are, of course, many other measures that can be used to address these different, as we said, while we were developing the resource guide, this needs to be like a comprehensive approach, but also trying to find the best measure to achieve these necessity and proportionality tests. There may be some less restrictive measures. Maybe we need to start looking at the practices, the business models of the companies, instead of trying to look at how we can make them assess and decide if something is legal or not online. Obviously, there are very specific prohibitions that companies that have already implemented in the context of, I don't know, terrorist-related content, child sexual abuse material, which are definitely measures and specific approaches that are being applied. But when it comes to this broader and more nuanced and that requires more nuanced assessment, it's difficult to start developing categories. And when you are trying to put the protection of freedom of expression as an exception rather than a rule, then is when the pieces of legislation start becoming more tricky. But I mean, I am very happy to share in the chat box the materials we have, the 2 pieces of legislation, and we will be very happy just to continue the conversation about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gutierrez. Very, very interesting. And if you wish to share anything in the chat box, please feel free to do so. It's very much appreciated. We have been notified by Mr. Eldrisen from Canada that he would like to take the floor. So please, sir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And it's an honor for me to be here today. My experiences are more related to the offline region. And of course, I had one of my constituents when I was first elected in 2008 was Amanda Lindhout, who had done sort of freelance journalism in Afghanistan and Somalia, and then she was kidnapped in Somalia. So I've had a lot of experience on that side of it, and again the attacks that female journalists have had is something that's uppermost in my mind. And of course, I look at it, and of course, I think about OSCE when we get everyone together. It's primarily parliamentarians, and we have a different view. Of course, we're tied into to journalists, but we have a different view, and we still have cyber trolls and threats that are against us. And I think that's how most parliamentarians will look at the issues. So when they are being presented, I think that's certainly something that a person should keep in mind. The other part, and I've been to a number of OSCE meetings and recognizing wartime journalism and the propaganda that comes out from all sides there. I think that's another issue that has to be figured into any discussions that we have. And I do have that one concern when we say concerns about laws that might be legal but harmful. It's very difficult to put that in. I know that Ms. Trianfi had said that bills can be easily abused, and I think that's very important as well. So I just wanted to give those thoughts to the advocates that we have here today. When we discuss this among parliamentarians, they may not have the same experiences that the advocates that we have are aware of. And again, so many of us think more about the physical safety for those that are in the field versus what can happen online. But it's not as though we don't have experiences that can be related to when it comes to attacks, because parliamentarians get the same sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for these thoughts. Unless any other member has a question or some thoughts to share, please feel free to do so. Unless you don't have any, I might have one to address to Mr. Whittingdale, actually. Sir, you have, during your tenure, you have introduced the National Action Plan in the British Parliament. May I kindly ask you what the mood in Parliament was and what the main drivers of discussion were back then? Because I think it might be interesting to hear how the debate was formed during this. Thank you.
You raise an important point. We felt very strongly that whilst my party was in government and was initiating the National Action Plan and the measures that would be taken as a part of that, it was extremely important that we demonstrated that this was not a party political issue. And so whilst the action plan had an introduction from a Prime Minister, we also obtained supporting quotes from the spokesman for all of the major parties represented in Parliament to demonstrate that this was not an issue on which there was any disagreement in Parliament, and that all parliamentarians believed that it was vitally important to strengthen the protection of journalists. And I think that that sent quite a clear message. And so I would recommend that if any party is bringing forward measures, then they do try and ensure that it does achieve cross-party support. And when we've had debates on press freedom in Parliament, and I've taken place in several, it has certainly always been the case that all those representing their different parties have supported the principle, and there has been very little disagreement. Just to come back quickly on one or two of the points raised, I mean, as I said, the online safety bill was introduced into Parliament yesterday. I spoke in the debate, and I had some reservations about this question of content which is deemed legal but harmful. It is a very complicated area, and the more we can specify for Parliament to say what kind of content is going to be judged to be harmful and should be removed by the platforms, I think that will introduce a much greater element of certainty. I think one of the concerns actually I have about the legislation as it currently stands is that the categories can be extended on the advice of a regulator, and I'm pleased to hear of the high reputation that Ofcom has, but at the end of the day, this needs to be determined by elected parliamentarians, not by regulators. And so we're at the beginning of what is going to be a very long debate on the detail of how this legislation will work. And obviously we will be looking at the experience in other countries, and we are in active dialogue with representatives of organisations like indeed Article 19. And I hope that we will continue to work with them so that we get this right.
Thank you very much, sir. Very, very enlightening, if I must say. I don't have any other requests for the floor. So maybe if I can ask one last question about data collection. We've seen from what we hear, we see that data is necessary to drive forward comprehensive policy making. So may I ask our expert speakers, Ms. Gutierrez and Ms. Triomfi, about what would be the optimal, your suggestion to our parliamentarians about data collection in their own countries?
Can I respond first, Barbara?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm nodding, but not saying
okay.
anything. Yes,
no,
the floor.
Yeah, and so definitely. So I think that part of these comprehensive approaches to adopt legislative and regulatory measures to the issue requires evidence, right? And sometimes, I mean, it has been civil society and many other groups who have been gathering and collecting information from experiences of women journalists and journalists in general. But it's definitely important if we look from this different multi-stakeholder approach. It's how to identify what institution can start collecting different types of information, and how can these different types of information can inform policy and legislative approaches. For example, if we start talking about if there is a protection mechanism that is also being start connected to a different body that will start receiving claims or different petitions about an attack. So this can be processed, and actually the resource guide covers this in the section on law enforcement and other institutions. So what this needs to be done is exactly to be able to identify what are the key trends, the issues, how are there some phenomena repeating and trends happening in response or as a result of other offline circumstances on attacks. But also, for example, if we start making this connection of the right to freedom of expression, safety of journalist mechanisms, and gender equality and non-discrimination, we can start looking at equality institutions. Maybe they can also play a role in developing studies, in generating information, surveys together with women journalists, with civil society. So it's important to have this evidence-based approach to regulatory measures. And this will also let all the other stakeholders justify or identify any other responses that maybe are not a piece of legislation that needs to be addressed. And of course, a very important aspect of this concerns the protection of privacy and data protection, because sometimes there have been a lot of cases where this information has also been misused by authorities. Let's say when law enforcement authorities mishandle some of the claims, and they can expose private information. So we need to think, when we think about this gender responsive approaches also to data collection from the different stakeholders, we need to make sure that we are asking them for their consent to share the information, how their sensitive information will be treated, how exactly will this be in the possession or holding by the authorities and for what purposes. So we need to have also this very strong approach to protecting their privacy and data protection when collecting all this data. I hope this is helpful, and you will find many of these things in the resource guide as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, the issue of privacy is primary, I think. Unless any other of our esteemed speakers or the representative of Mr. Busser wish to take the floor, we can proceed with our agenda. I don't think this is the case. So this brings us to Dr. Heidi Fry from Canada, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Special Representative on Gender Issues. She was appointed to this position in October 2010, and she has been reappointed since. She currently serves as the longest serving female member of the Canadian Parliament. Together with Mr. Johan Busser, she is leading actually this joint initiative between the RFoM and the OSCE on the safety of journalists. And just as a reminder, allow me to inform you that Dr. Fry issued last year her annual gender balance report, focusing particularly on the issue of violence against women journalists and politicians, followed by an appeal to act to our membership. Dear Special Representative, dear Dr. Fry, thank you for joining so early in Canada, and I now pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I must say it was a most interesting morning. I'm glad I got up early to attend it. This is a very important issue. And I wanted to just go over what everyone said, because everyone made very important points. I mean, if we look, for instance, at what Mr. Busser said, I think it's important to note that Sweden is also looking at hosting journalists who are being persecuted in Sweden. That's a good thing for us to think of as other nation states. I think the idea that journalism and real news or journalists are actually contributors to a democracy is really important. Today, we're seeing the democracies are under fire all around the world by authoritarian states and also by private sector people. And I think we need to remember how important democracy is and how important it is if we're going to have a rules-based order. Journalists actually are key because of the freedom of the press, because of freedom of the information, because they quite often debunk disinformation. I think we've again heard from Ms. Ribeiro, of course, who talked about the need for diversity of expression and the need for inclusive public debate. This is an important thing that journalists do. They are a public good. They bring to the public the idea of informed debate. And I think that's a really important thing for us to guard against. I think we need, as we talked on earlier on, we talked about how the UK adopted a national action plan, and we listened to Ms. Trinolfi, who talked a lot about being careful, about how online attacks not only affect the individual who gets them or who is the subject of the attack, but it can also dampen the whole idea of the general institution of media, free press, and journalism, and that it can, in fact, the bottom line in their economic ability to stay afloat. And we're seeing that in our own country here in Canada, where consolidation of the media is creating almost a monolithic ability to get information, and we're losing information from local, regional news. And I think that this is something to think about as well. So I think, we're looking at how the impact this is on the people's ability to know what is happening and to sift the difference between fake news, between disinformation, and between the kind of ethical guidelines that most journalists have, which is to use data, to use information, to be able to give people the real information they need to make informed choice in any kind of democracy. And I think this is the sort of thing that we are hearing about from Ms. Trinolfi. But I also think that it's important, what she mentioned is that this is often seems to be individuals, and in some cases, of course, state-sponsored dampening of journalism, and of course, authoritarian regimes throwing journalists into jail, etc. But what she said, I thought was most important. She talked about the fact that this is not a happening thing that comes about by coincidence, that it's quite often coordinated and it's intentional. Even when we see individual trolls attacking journalists online, it is a coordinated and intentional thing that's happening here. And I think that I thought it was very interesting that she talked about the fact that women journalists are being afraid to speak out, but that this, including people from minority groups who are also journalists, that this is an easy place to attack online, mainly because of pre-existing conditions, institutional discrimination, societal discrimination, a tendency to look at the credibility of women as being less than the credibility of men, the ability to look at the credibility of people from minority groups to be diminished. So this is an important kind of way, and we're seeing why the attack is occurring is because it's to diminish credibility. And I think that's something important as well. But I think what she talked about that was most interesting is that in fact there has become self-censorship, that there's a loss of voices from diversity groups, from women and from other minority groups, but that in fact that they're leaving the profession because they're afraid. And the fact that we're hearing that if we don't get that diversity, whether it's regional diversity, local news diversity, or diversity of voices from different population groups, that we actually lose the whole concept of what journalism is about and what freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of information, and freedom of expression is all about. So I think it's really important. She also brought up something that I thought was interesting about training and awareness of the police and of the judiciary to implement legislation. We need to talk to and train the police and judiciary so that they would be able to take seriously any reports from journalists that they are being harassed or that they're being threatened online or in person. And I think that Ms. Gutierrez made some important points about how we have to use data and evidence-based information, but at the same time, guarantee privacy of that information. But because we need to build that gap between theory and practice, evidence-based information allows us to do that. It gives credibility to the information that we're intending to do. And I think she put forward a problem that we're all facing in our parliaments. How do you make sure that legislation does not undermine freedom of expression in general? How do we make sure that as we bring forward legislation, it doesn't dampen technology and the use of technology? These kinds of unintended consequences that she talked about, I think were extremely important. And then she pointed to Ireland, who said that they are using pre-existing harassment laws, discrimination laws, and hate laws to build on being able to look at this issue. So there's not one solution, and I think that was the importance of what Ms. Gutierrez told us. I think we heard from the United Kingdom that I know that in Canada here, we were one of the founding members with the UK of this media freedom group and to host that very first joint conference in 2019. And that now 50 nations have joined. And this is all great. But in fact, if the 50 nations who joined are not doing anything to move forward with real action plans, then it's all very nice to sit around in a group and talk. And this is what the whole issue we're dealing with here. At the end of the day, as at the beginning, Ms. Ribeiro said, this is about let's get some teeth into what we're going to do, get some action behind what we're going to do. I think the United Kingdom is actually put forward a bill, which in Canada we are discussing right now at government levels, because we worked closely with the United Kingdom and the 50 nations, to talk about how we can look at online platforms bearing the responsibility for action, to look at how they decide what, through some sort of ethical set of guidelines, how they decide what constitutes harm when it comes on their platforms. And I think that means that we're looking at the actual work that needs to be done by platforms so that we don't dampen the voices of users. And I think that is something that we need to remember. I think the second thing that the UK is doing that was very important for us to think about was our ability for us to bring about public awareness, not only public awareness of education about how to sift online information that we're getting, how to sift truth from disinformation, fake news, and facts, but also to understand the value of journalism, it being a public good, it being the thing that keeps our democracies floating, one of the pillars of democracies. I think, again, we are finding that there is going to be debate on all of this because of that, what Ms. Gutierrez pointed out, that ability to balance freedom of speech, freedom of expression, use of technology with the ability to protect and look at online journalists. And I want to just go back to Mr. Dreesen talking about how parliamentarians are facing this as well, and how it's really important for debates to occur. And I point again to the United Kingdom having this debate on World Press Freedom Day, in which they take that day to debate again the issues that we're facing. I think social media has changed things a lot from us. We know that print journalists and television journalists and people who report on radio do have clear Broadcasting Act regulations in most countries that they follow, that allows, that make them responsible if they put out false news, give them responsibility for not spreading false information, for not being libelous, etc. The only place that we haven't had that kind of ability to bring that kind of ethical debate, that kind of ethical, what can I say, ethical processes involved in is online. Online has, in fact, started off in most countries and became a free-for-all. And so it's now going to be a challenge to put that back in the bottle. But I wanted you to know that I think it's most important that we're doing this, because when we hear that 4 out of 5 journalists feel that they're facing abuse and violence, when we hear that 1 in 3 do not feel safe giving the news, doing what journalists tend to do. We also know that about 38% of journalists, female journalists actually, as we heard, do not want to write on certain topics because they're afraid. And we know that the online threats are not just simply, sticks, as my mother used to say, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never harm me. But words harm. Words are very dangerous. And when you have female journalists online being threatened with rape, being threatened with physical violence, having their families threatened, it is no wonder that 38% of them say that they pick and choose what they're going to write. That in itself is a restriction on freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. But at the same time, we can understand their fear. And then it is up to us as parliamentarians to come up with some solutions. It's not going to be easy, but I think, I know Ms. Ribeiro challenged me to come up with a resolution at the end of this. And I haven't really had the ability while listening to actually put down a really comprehensive resolution that is written nicely, etc. But I think a resolution should be that we look at legislation in our countries that will in fact build on existing legislation with regard to hate, with regard to discrimination, with regard to violence, and build on that like Ireland did. I think we could look at legislation, but we also need to look at how legislation does not dampen freedom of speech and freedom of technology. And perhaps that legislation should look at platforms themselves being monitors of what is online harm and what they should take down and how they should do that. And again, the ability of some sort of regulator. And I know that parliamentarians feel that we need to make all the decisions, but what a regulator does is, and reporting to Parliament itself, what a regulator does is bring in that objective look, so that parliamentarians we know come from different political parties. We disagree on what we need to do, and sometimes we get bogged down when we're trying to find a balance. If we had a regulator that was looking at our legislation to ensure that platforms are doing what they're supposed to do, that platforms are being careful, and that are, in fact, removing things online. And we see during war right now, disinformation is rampant on both sides. Who knows what to believe? So how do we get online platforms to look at this and monitor it and take down what they know to be propaganda and what they know to be disinformation? So I would like to see a resolution that builds on legislation that actually finds that balance, that holds platforms responsible, with a regulator possibly making sure that it happens. I would like to see us bring forward something that's going to talk about public education, public awareness, not only of how to use and understand social media and online platforms, but how to also understand the need for freedom of the press as a very core pillar of a democracy. And finally, I think it's important, as we heard, to build and to support, as parliaments, non-governmental bodies that are based on protecting journalists, protecting freedom of speech, looking at some of the hate and some of the violence online, and finding ways to deal with that and to diffuse it. So it could contain 3 pieces, as this resolution that I'm trying to think of, Ms. Ribeiro, and I don't know if that's sufficient to get somebody with a pen to sit down and pull that together, noting the balance that we needed to find, that we heard from Ms. Gutierrez. Also, a piece of that could also be gathering data, so that whatever we do is based on solid evidence, and we make evidence-based decisions and not ideological and almost, what can I say, knee-jerk reactions to things. So legislation supporting education programs for the public, looking at ways in which non-governmental bodies, civil society can move forward to help to build the kinds of responses that we have. But I just wanted to thank the presenters. You were succinct. You made a lot of sense. You pointed out the pitfalls. You pointed out that we need to do something, but that we need to do it carefully. I think the United Kingdom is giving us a good example. Sweden has given us an example of helping journalists who are actually harassed by their own state, by their own nation states and their own governments, and looking at how we take best practices from countries that are beginning to work on this, Ireland being one, the United Kingdom being another, and Canada right now. We are also working on similar legislation as the United Kingdom is doing, because we cannot allow democracy to fail. And given that journalism is a pillar of democracy, given that female journalists are in fact more harassed and attacked and fearful than male journalists, we need to actually move forward and do something. So again, I want to thank you all. I want to thank you for all the work you've done and how important this issue is. And I want to hope that we go back and get some teeth going in our respective parliaments. There are 50 nations that have joined with Canada and the United Kingdom to look at bringing about an action plan. But I think that the other 48 need to start working and start moving forward and start building on the kinds of legislation, policies, programs that we need to do to move forward and protect freedom of the press and protect specifically the vulnerable components and the intersectionality within journalism itself, i.e. gender and or racialized groups, etc., so that we make sure that we hear that diversity of voices. So thank you again for allowing me to wrap up. Thank you again for allowing me to be part of this really exciting and interesting forum. And I feel we're on the cusp of something great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry, for these inspiring and thought-provoking, and I might say provoking too, words, and also for highlighting that ensuring the safety of journalists is a long and difficult, but a truly important progress for the entirety of our region and beyond, of course. Dear participants, I sincerely hope you found this event useful and interesting. I believe we can all agree that there are significant policy challenges in the context of the safety of journalists, and in particular of safety of female journalists online. This, however, should not discourage us. On the contrary, it is critical we continue talking about these challenges and to look for adequate and long-lasting solutions during our support to and also to support OSCE parliaments. For that reason, an outcome document will be shared with you during the following days, which together with your contributions, also through the questionnaire, which will remain open, will guide our activities ahead. With this, we have come to the end of today's event. Before we close this session, I would like to sincerely thank all our speakers, Ms. Gutierrez, Ms. Triomfi, and Mr. Whittingdale, for the valuable insights, and of course, all the participants who joined us today. A big thank you goes to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Rapporteur of the Third Committee, Mr. Boozer, and of course, the representative of Freedom of the Media, Ms. Ribeiro, and of course, Dr. Fry, who are the main drivers behind this initiative. My sincere thanks goes, of course, to all our colleagues in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and in the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, who worked for the organization of this event, as well as to our Secretary General, Roberto Montella, and our President, Margareta Sederfeld, who both strongly support our work in this field. Finally, a special thanks goes to my supervisor, Hanna Djokovic, who entrusted me with moderating today's event next to our esteemed RFoM colleagues. The meeting is closed.
Thank you all so much for joining.
Bye, everyone.